Top of the, I guess, morning it is, basketball fans. Appreciate everybody for checking in and joining me here on the live. We got it live on the IG now. We got it up and streaming perfectly here on our StreamYard app, streaming everywhere that you find your favorite podcast, where you can locate exactly what this is. The Final Buzzer with DeShaun Tate, roughly about 15 minutes or so after the last concluding game of the NBA playoffs, Monday through Friday. So I appreciate everybody for checking in. Make sure that you go and hit that subscribe button everywhere you find your favorite podcast, that being iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, as well as Stitcher and Red Circle. Plus, make sure that you subscribe on YouTube as well. So again, this is the Final Buzzer. Appreciate everybody for checking in, and just kind of want to give a little bit of a recap from what we saw earlier tonight. A pair of 2 versus 3 seed games, both of them potential, one of them for sure, closeout games and elimination games. And so definitely want to give some opportunity to recap that. Make sure that you follow along on all social media platforms, that being Instagram as well as Twitter at Tate's Take Hoops, TATES TAKEHOOPS, hashtag where basketball lives. So you already know that. Now, before we jump into the games themselves, let me say this first. I just want to give a quick 10-15 second moment of silence. As we know, today is 9/11, 19 years after the tragic things that took place in New York City around this time 19 years ago. So let's give about 10-15 seconds to just kind of honor and pay homage to those whose lives were lost and those who were affected. All right, now that we got that out the way, let's start out with the very first game of the night. The number 2 seeded Los Angeles Clippers taking on the 3 seeded Denver Nuggets. We saw Denver take down the Clippers in game, what was that? Game 5? Yeah, game 5, 111-105 in the Western Conference semis. And I definitely want to let's start out with the losers. I like to start out with the winners, but I want to start out with the losers first, where you have this being a Clippers team that has never reached the Western Conference Finals in franchise history. And if they plan to do so, then they're definitely going to have to be waiting at least another 48 hours or so. But even more so, I think one of the most disappointing thing for this Clippers team is that they're getting a Denver team that, has apparently we thought had exerted all of their energy from the game 7 that they played in against Utah. And then even more so, wondering exactly where all that energy was going to go. And you get behind when you're down 3-1. That's just one of those types of situations in which you don't really have a lot of gas left in the tank. You don't really, not saying you don't have anything to play for, but you start to lose confidence quite a bit. Anybody can imagine that would be the case for them, but they consistently stuck in there. And not only that, but they went down somewhere really close to near about 20 points or so. And when that happens, you tend to lose your touch. And especially if you have to rely on a player that got the veteran leadership and the veteran experience like a Paul Millsap, who's still yet, even though you have all that offensive firepower, you're not able to hit the shots that you need in order to win. But you follow that up by really having to kind of, rely on him. And when you're put in that position, there's so much uncertainty behind being put in that position and trying to get stops at the same time. And we know that the Clippers are also a very good defensive team, but they're not a terrible offensive team either. So with that being said, sometimes I feel like this Clippers team, as much people has had confidence in them, like the way that they've kept flipping back and forth between them and the Lakers. Like you think about it, the season started, and I know a couple people have heard me say this before, but the season started and the Clippers and the Lakers were the two front runners for the Western Conference. Clearly, that's the case here because they're the number 1 and the number 2 seeds. Okay, cool. So when that happens, they meet head to head in the regular season, and the Clippers win 2 games out of what I believe is 3 against the Lakers. Most people would consider the Clippers to be the better team, that the Lakers is not as much of a match for them per se. You follow that up by going into the resumption into the NBA bubble, and the Lakers are not playing nearly as good, even though they did finish the season with a higher seeding and a better record, obviously. They turn that around, and the Lakers are now looking better than the Clippers, or not as good as the Clippers after that. Then you have a situation where the Clippers are in position to where obviously the Lakers were having some issues. The Lakers turn around and aren't looking as good as the Clippers. Now the Clippers is looking better than the Lakers. It's really mind-boggling for what this is ultimately going to be set up to look like, which is the Lakers and the Clippers. The Clippers were struggling with Dallas. We saw the Lakers struggle just one game against the Trail Blazers. And then the Clippers were looking like the more dominant team again. Now the Lakers are looking like the more dominant team again, and I don't think that this is really a situation in which the Clippers could really afford from a confidence standpoint, but both of these teams are teams that can afford or feel like they can afford to flip the switch. They can flip that switch so quickly, and while that is definitely a good thing, that can also be a bad thing because not everybody you're going to be able to let off the gas when you're playing against them. We saw that last night with the Lakers against Houston. We clearly saw that happen tonight with the Clippers against the Nuggets. And now the Nuggets have a little bit of fire all over again running through their body, in which, they're down 3-2, so it's not the biggest margin in the world. However, I will say enough to say that, it's you got to take this thing one game by game. And that's exactly what is happening. Clearly, the Clippers had converted on more threes in Game 5 than they did this entire series. And you kind of question, is this the best brand of Clippers basketball that we have seen? It's going to be maybe not very likely, but there's still a chance that both of these LA teams can be going into the next round with 2 losses under their belt in the Western Conference semis, because I don't think that the Lakers are quite at that point where they could just erase anything that Houston can bring their way starting on tomorrow. But being the only team in the NBA that has 4 players that average 18 plus points per game for the Clippers during the regular season, that just tells you how good of an offensive team that they are, in addition to how good they are defensively. And also, the Clippers keeping Denver out of the game with their 3-point efficiency was something else that kind of scares me if I'm the Clippers, because of the simple fact that they were shooting it so well for such a long duration of the time of the game. But the problem was that they couldn't get stops. And that's not something that is like Clippers basketball. If they don't do anything else, they have the ability to move guys around and have enough guys to get stops. Montrezl Harrell in the front court, 6th Man of the Year award winner and recipient. You have Paul George, obviously, who's a pretty darn good defender. Maybe not a great defender, but a really good one. And for most reasons why people would consider him not a great defender is because you have great defenders that are playing alongside of him, i.e. being Kawhi Leonard, obviously, arguably the best 2-way player in the NBA. And then you have Pat Beverly, who's just an absolute pest out there on the floor. So that's it as far as the Clippers go. I want to get into the Denver Nuggets a little bit. I was a little curious to see exactly how Michael Porter Jr. would do after some of his Game 4 post-game comments where he spoke the truth. But I'm not really sure that I can go as far as to say that he got that kind of pull just yet, as technically being a rookie and feel like the ball should be distributed beyond the hands of just 2 players necessarily. Those 2 players I feel like everybody knows is the Joker and Jamal Murray. And I feel like that's a huge reason behind why they won the game on tonight, obviously with a lot of help from Paul Millsap. Obviously even though Michael Porter Jr. didn't really contribute the way you would think that he should after making the kind of comments that he did. I will say that, he did step up on the defensive end with a huge block, also some key rebounds down the stretch, and sinking some free throws that take some really big balls to make those shots against a really, really good team in a closeout game elimination situation. Jamal Murray, I thought, needed a huge statistical game. I don't think that he necessarily had that. I think you needed to be somewhere in the high 30s. He didn't do that. But I also felt like he needed to get out in the open court a little bit more, out into transition, force some of the Clippers defense to kind of get on their heels a little bit, do some backpedaling and so forth, and prevent them from kind of setting up their defense, if you will. That didn't happen, but they were still able to find a way to get a victory. And I mean, kudos to them for doing that, because that would have been probably not only the most ideal way, but that certainly was, I think, the elephant in the room on how the only way that is what it's going to take in order to beat this team. And if you don't do that, then you're going to be heading back home while they're headed to the Western Conference Finals for the first time in franchise history. And I want to know, how much pride will Denver show? And they showed a lot of it. They could have easily thrown in the towel. They could have easily given up when they had that opportunity to do so, being down almost 20 points or so. And they didn't do that. And that's where you kind of got to give them some credit, because it didn't really come from defensively, or not only defensively, but specifically it came offensively. And that's something that I'm not sure I realistically would see in a closeout situation, especially after they played so poorly in the first half. For them to do that in the second half and still show some dog and still show some fight, I think that, that definitely speaks volume for that particular team. How much of the round two, how much of the lack of success in this particular round was really going to be blamed on Game 7 situation against the Utah Jazz? And we don't have to worry about that nearly as much. I was hoping I didn't have to hear any of those excuses. But they didn't make any excuses. They went out there and they showed some heart and they fought. But just seeing the way that this whole NBA playoffs has gone this entire time with so many different Game 7s, these teams that's coming out of Game 7 while the other team is kind of sitting back, resting and waiting on them, they've definitely been showing some heart. They've definitely been showing some grit. Getting out there after loose balls and doing all the little things. This Denver team is one that, while it has some playoffs experience, not as much as the Clippers do, but that experience showed tonight. I feel like if they were a team a year ago, like what we saw, they probably wouldn't have been getting to this point, considering some of the errors that they showed and put on display of the last 2 or 3 games leading up to this point. And even more so, I expected a competitive game. When you have closeout situations, that's something that you have to take into account. That's what I love about playoff basketball. And I know everybody's in their football mode, but that's the best thing about playoff basketball, is because nobody wants to go home. Nobody. I mean, you got family that's able to come in and join you and root you on. And so from that standpoint, you can see that you have no choice but to fight. I love stand and fight mentality, stand and fight programs, stand and fight organizations, stand and fight franchises. And that's exactly what they did. Gary Harris, who picked up his 4th foul, ironically enough, he committed that with 9 minutes left remaining in the third quarter. So with only less than 3 minutes played in the fourth quarter, Gary Harris being one of those players that you really need. You don't have Will Barton. You needed him for some offensive reasons, but not nearly as much as you do need him defensively, and not having him for that duration amount of time and still able to come out, get a couple stops, but still make shots on the other end is where you have to credit the most. And eventually he did check back in and see the floor and fouled out with, 2 minutes left in the fourth quarter when, this game was still in reach for the Clippers, and obviously being a really well-coached team. And it wasn't enough, and so regardless what happens the rest of the way, Denver being able to win 2 games, and I know this isn't really what they got their sights set on and what they're locked in and focused on, them being able to win 2 games, I think is showing that they are trending in the right direction. But I do, however, understand that they do have higher hopes. And they're still in this thing. They're still playing to win. I know everybody's writing them off and still, figure they got 2 more games to win if they want to close out, the Clippers. I can only imagine what the people who like to bet all that big money out in Vegas are, really thinking in terms of how much money can you really win. I got to see what those lines are going to look like on Sunday for Game 6. But taking Denver sounds like a pretty bad idea right now, depending on how bad you need those bills paid, I guess. Denver is one of 4 teams to play back-to-back series in effort to erase a 3-1 deficit, and that's in NBA history. That's not just this year. That's just not within the last few years. That is in NBA history. And so when you start talking about being down 3-1 and the potential of coming back and winning a series, I'm not sure that, Denver also in game, what are we looking at? This was Game 5. So Game 3, they had this game for 3.5 quarters. And obviously, and unfortunately for them, they weren't able to close it out. But they came really, really close to being able to do so. They made a couple little minor adjustments here and there, and that they're still playing for this thing. So they still have a shot. They still have a chance. They're also 4-1 in terms of their record in the last 2 seasons facing elimination games. And Paul Millsap, that veteran leadership and just everything that he brings to the table in terms of size, high basketball IQ, former NBA All-Star, showed tonight. And just hearing, Jamal Murray say in the post-game press conference that they played their best brand of basketball when their backs are up against the wall. And we'll find out exactly if that still remains true when Sunday rolls around, because their back is going to be up against the wall probably more than any other point in this particular series. And if it goes to a Game 7, I can see their back being up against the wall a little bit more, but nobody's going to be giving them a shot when Sunday rolls around. So that's in terms of, the first game of the doubleheader. I kind of want to get into the second game of the doubleheader now, which is the one that everybody has been really excited about and really looking forward to the most, where we saw the number 3 seeded Boston Celtics. And I got a smile on my face. I'm feeling pretty good about myself right now, because I did pick this Boston team to be the one to go on and take on the Lakers in the NBA Finals, and they have that opportunity, but they're going to have to go through the Miami Heat in order to do so after advancing past the number 2 seeded and former I guess they're technically still the NBA champion, but defending world champion, Toronto Raptors, 92-87, winning it 4-3 in 7 games for the Eastern Conference semis. And I don't have a ton for Toronto tonight. I mean, if I'm just being quite honest about it, I mean, they fought themselves back all the way to be in this position. That was probably the scariest thing about them being in this spot, just because of the simple fact that, they're down 2-0 in the series to start it out. It takes a heroic shot with 0.5 seconds left on the clock that myself didn't even believe that they were going to be able to hit that shot, OG Anunoby, and then win games on top of that, 2 more games where Boston had the opportunity to close them out. And they're the more veteran team over Denver. And I do understand, that Brad Stevens is in position where he's playing with a chip on his shoulder because, he's underachieved in recent years. And Kyrie Irving, that whole situation didn't necessarily work out for this team. But here they are without him, and without a player that, clearly has completed and graduated from his rehab and quarantine process. The staff has been impressed with that, being Gordon Hayward, being impressed with his recovery timing and the progress that he has made. being out 9 games with an apparent ankle injury, saying that he's ahead of schedule now and expected back sooner than later. That's 17 points per game erased from what you're able to bring to the table, where you desperately need some offense, because Toronto's not a bad defensive team either, let alone the Miami Heat and so forth. But that's really hard to erase that. And when you've got young guys, not the most experienced guys, we're talking about, Grant Williams, and I know they've got some experience, Kemba Walker, some of those guys, but it's not like Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum are the two most experienced playoff guys, in the world. But they took a lot of heat last year, around this time last 2 years actually, for not showing up. And so I'm curious to know, just kind of asking you, are they the best wing duo in the NBA? Are they the best wing duo in the Eastern Conference? Be sure to let me know what you think on social media at Tate's Take Hoops by answering that question for me, because if they are not the best, they're certainly right up in that range of being the best, if I'm just being honest. How would Kemba Walker perform after his Game 6 outing, and considering his recent play? I got to a point where I was like, I don't know if this dude's throwing games or what. He couldn't hit the backside of a barn with any of his jump shots. And while he was facilitating and getting guys in position, I felt like that's what he's supposed to do if you're a point guard. But he hasn't played remotely close to being the player that we all expected him to come in and be. And now it's kind of got me scratching my head a little bit and wondering, because if you're not playing all that great for the first game or whatever, or you're not playing all that great for the first series, those things are understandable. But when you're an all-star and you're, coming in and taking the place of Kyrie Irving, I'm expecting for you to lead the pack and lead the way when you have some of these younger guys are sitting back looking at you. I mean, Marcus Smart has had, not saying he's a terrible player, but Marcus Smart has had a better put together, not just better performances than Kemba, but much better performances than Kemba. Not just tonight, but in this series, in the last series, maybe not arguably all season long, but what we remember as people is what's happening right here and right now. And that's going to be an issue for them going forward, because this is a Miami team whose defense is better than Toronto's, and they're going to be ready. And I'm not sure that this is something that Marcus Smart can do by himself in terms of carrying that load when it comes to the veteran guys that you need, regardless as to whether they do or don't get Gordon Hayward back. And I was even asked earlier, like, who's their best player? I don't know who their best player is. I mean, over time, you're asking me the question. I'm probably going to say Kemba Walker is their best player. But this emergence of Jason Tatum will have everybody saying that he's the best player. And, I like to go with the light-skinned guys. That's just one of the things that I do. That's just typical DeShaun Tate. But I can't necessarily say that, because I think that there's growing pains that Jason Tatum hasn't quite gone through yet to be considered their best player. And that's not a bad thing. That's just the fact that they have so many good players on their team. I don't know the best one, because guess what? They've got a player in Jaylen Brown who I don't think they would be in this position without him, who went down with an injury tonight and hurt himself and still stayed out there on the floor. That's what winning is all about. And that dude's a warrior. Like, he can go somewhere else and lead a team himself, perhaps, or be the leading scorer, or be, that guaranteed second option or guaranteed first option. Maybe it wouldn't surprise me to see Jaylen Brown do that. And he might be the best player on this team. A lot of people might say I'm crazy for that. However, you think about it, he's probably been the most consistent guy on this roster this whole playoffs. I know Marcus Smart has been a huge part of what they've been able to do in terms of winning games, adding a number to the left side of the result column. He doesn't get nearly as much of the credit that he deserves for his offensive ability. And again, not the most terrible thing. It's a little unfortunate, but it's not the worst thing in the world, because of the simple fact that he's such a good player defensively. He does all the little things. He's getting on the ground after loose balls. He's creating second chance points, rebounds, stepping in between passing lanes, frustrating players mentally. I mean, he's doing all of these little things, and that's something that you have to have in a player. I'm not saying that they're going to win a championship because they're not, and I'm not picking them to. However, what I will say is those are the types of players that you need on your team if you want to win championships, much like Draymond Green. Like, he is the Draymond Green of the Boston Celtics, essentially. That's just who he is. I even mentioned another guy that a lot of people don't pay attention to, and you really kind of got to lock in and key in on him when he's on the floor and pay very close attention to the way that he impacts and affects the game. And that's Robert Williams, who is, inserting him into the lineups early, maybe not as a starter, coming off the bench, but in that rotation. That is a very underrated move by the head coach and Brad Stevens. And that's where you have to give him a lot of credit, because that's been a consistent, ongoing thing. Him in the early moments of games, and then of course Grant Williams in the latter moments of games. The Williams boys, the Williams brothers, I guess, especially up front where they need that help to assist Daniel Tice. That's what makes Brad Stevens such an underrated coach, and I don't think people give that credit. I wanted to know, coming into Game 7, how the winner would be affected by this Game 7 on Tuesday in the Eastern Conference Finals when they play the Miami Heat. And we've seen so much. It feels like we've seen a plethora of Game 7s when we really haven't. It seems like we've seen so many games go down to the wire. September Madness is what I like to call it, like a March Madness type feel. But being in a Game 7 type situation where we saw Denver do it, and they're still, fighting for their life. I'm trying to think of who else was in a Game 7, because I feel like there was another Game 7 that was played, but nonetheless, it's not a write-off. It's not a situation where you could just automatically say this team's going to lose. Like, these guys are fighting. And that's what I love about fights. You better believe the same way that Denver is fighting tooth and nail for everything against the Clippers is the same way that I expected from Boston against Miami, a much more realistic series, a much more realistic team that can potentially win that series. Again, we talked about Jaylen Brown and his injury. It looks like a groin. That happened to me before, and I was out for like 8 to 9 months. Now, I'm not an NBA athlete. I'm not professional, anything remotely close to that. But just the way that it looked, cherry picking and all, like there was a pop that was heard. I didn't go back out there and play, but crediting Jaylen Brown for doing so. And while he did play a little bit more gingerly, and that's expected, he still stayed out there on the floor, and he still had impacts on this game as he went out with 9:40 remaining left in the fourth quarter. I was thinking, with this loss for Boston, like that could have potentially been a bigger disappointment than Milwaukee losing because of the injuries and so forth. And I know that Boston had one here and there, and not having Kyrie, but our expectations of Boston in this series, especially after they went up 2-0, was something of a much different ilk in my brain anyways, as to what the expectations were from for Milwaukee, coming into the playoffs, period, even against Orlando, where I thought Orlando would get a game, and they did. Then there's, Daniel Tice, who, yes, fouled out after 11 seconds of entering the game again, with 1:21 remaining in the fourth quarter, where Boston basically showed that even they are strong in that area because they had to rely on Grant Williams, who showed why he is so beneficial with his presence being out there on the floor. A rookie. Okay, we talked about him and Robert Williams, both of them young players. Robert Williams, a second-year player, third year maybe? Okay, Grant Williams being a rookie and being put out there in critical game time situations, that is a real team. That is a real staff. That is a real franchise. This is a real organization. Like, there's reasons behind why the Boston Celtics has played and won more game sevens than anybody else in the entire NBA. And Daniel Tice is just another one of those players who don't get that kind of credit from it may get it from his peers, but from around the NBA. Just like the last game we saw 2 nights ago on, what was that, Wednesday? It seems like lobs was being thrown his way. He was just backdoor Joe all night long. Each and every single time the ball went up in the air, nobody was blocking him out. And he's still Daniel Tice at the end of the day. He's not this Joel Embiid or anybody that gets plays necessarily run for him. He is a garbage man that is making the most and the best out of his situation. And if you just pay close attention, they do dump the ball down there to him, and you don't see very many back against the basket players very much anymore. He's one of them. He's not taking a bunch of jump shots facing up from 12, 15, 18 feet out. He's getting the ball from time to time outside of garbage plays, putting a guy on his hip the way that this game was designed to be played in that center position, and turning around and pump faking once or twice and getting a guy in the opposition in the air once or twice, and then right off the backboard for easy baskets. That's what playoff basketball is about. That makes it really tough because you don't get very many easy basket opportunities. And with that, that's something that Boston has been able to do. Again, going back to the mastermind of Brad Stevens and the way that he's drawn this thing up. With this being a players' league, you don't nearly get as much publicity if you're a coach, because you get the money, but you don't get because it's a players' league. But what we saw with Boston today were things that, and this is credit to Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum and all of these guys, because they're the ones putting the ball in the basket. Don't make a mistake about it. But we learned a lot about a guy who has a chip on his shoulder right now in Brad Stevens, drawing up plays, making the difference, getting guys to buy into a system, not having Gordon Hayward, that's almost 20 points off your board, off of your roster, that's sitting there and waiting in a boot, or was in a boot. And now preparing to be a part of the Eastern Conference Finals against the Miami Heat. So, I, as much credit as I give the players, again, Daniel Tice, I definitely want to give him some love, but you got to give some to Brad Stevens on this one. Kyle Lowry obviously fouls out with 34 seconds remaining in the fourth quarter, and that's what I really feel like, that sealed the deal for the Toronto Raptors. Last and certainly not least, Jason Tatum, the second youngest player now in NBA history, 25 plus points, 10 plus rebounds, and 5 plus assists in a game 7 situation. Ironically enough, RIP to late Kobe Bryant was the first player to do that. And I think that just kind of goes to show exactly how special of a player that we are seeing in Jason Tatum. He's a young player, and the future is very bright. LeBron James even mentioned it multiple times when he lists a combination of probably about 5 different players. John Morant, I think, Trae Young, Luka Doncic, some of those players. Jason Tatum was in that same conversation, and he deserves it. He deserves that right. He's earned it. But he's going to have his hands full when Tuesday rolls around. When Tuesday rolls around and they play up against the Miami Heat. So I appreciate everybody for checking in to the Final Buzzer with DeShaun Tate. Again, you guys know we do this every Monday through Friday, roughly 15 minutes or so following and concluding the very last NBA playoff game of the night. So Monday it will be back, and make sure that you go and subscribe to Tate's Take, the podcast, everywhere that you find your favorite podcast, that being iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, red circle as well. And be sure to subscribe to the YouTube page, Tate's Take, as well, and follow along on all social media platforms, Twitter, IG, or Instagram, or the gram, or whatever the cool kids call it nowadays, at Tate's Take Hoops, TATESTAKEHOOPS, hashtag where basketball lives. See you guys in roughly around, see how good my math is, 72 hours or so. I feel like that sounds about right. Appreciate you for checking in.